Hello and welcome to Shared.Care's What is Manly radio show and podcast. Men feel more lonely, lost, and not useful in society than ever in history. Males are not attaching to school, work, or women. What it means to be a man appears lost. Is there a framework for being manly that we can unearth?
Welcome to Share.Care, an all-inclusive community sharing experience, strength, and hope to create strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships. Share.Care communities work toward every individual feeling safe, valued, and heard, free from the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Each episode, founder Damian Andrews explores the principles underpinning Share.Care and invites expert special guests to share their knowledge so you can easily reap the benefits so many others experience. You hold the choice to create your future. Let it be with strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships.
G'day Nick, how are you going?
Doing well.
Yeah,
Excellent.
it's wonderful in this world, and you'll be used to it, having a technology background. But now that people are getting used to this idea, we can talk around the world without actually having to jump on a plane. It's pretty cool.
No, it is. It's amazing. It really is.
It really
Makes
connects
life
us.
a lot easier. So
It does. I can imagine that as well. And for the audience, we have Nick Tirnanich. He's the founder of NicTech, a world-class digital consulting agency, and he is passionate about how technology can empower the human experience, which I think is really relevant to the topic that we're talking about, what is manly, and the fact that men are feeling more lost, lonely, and don't have a place in the world, particularly when we look at it from the perspective of with technology now, we're more connected than ever in history, yet people do feel more lonely than ever in history. But if we want to stay on that topic of what is manly, what's your experience and what have you seen out in the world at the moment? We start more globally, and then we can narrow down to some specific things. What have you seen out in the world where under this topic of people, men being lonely, lost, and not feeling useful in society?
well, unfortunately, I think that's a very, very prevalent problem.
Mm,
Um, I've seen it very much. Someone like myself who grew up in the United States, in the Upper Midwest, and very much a Middle America, very typical upbringing.
mm,
Uh, I feel that regardless of a socioeconomic background or where you might live, I feel like
mm,
a lot of the issues that men are encountering really result of just the modern world that we live in.
mm,
I feel like because things are more technology and more modernity,
mm,
not to get too philosophical here, but I feel like a lot of young men don't have as much connection, or sometimes these traditions or even your local community have been eroded, for lack of a better term, due to a lot of the digital and technological advancements and things just in general being more transient. I feel in this modern era where I know for example, for my grandparents' generation, they barely left their town or a very small radius.
yeah.
Now it's very, very common for people in many different lines of work to receive an education very far away from where they grew up.
Mm,
Brothers or sisters or parents might move to another part of the city or to another part of the country or even an entirely different country. So things
yeah.
like that, I feel like there's people in general are just much more transient. You know,
Do you think, and with that being transient, do you think that's stopping people from being connected? Even though we still connect over technology, we still can communicate people like you and I are communicating now, but we're not developing those same kind of relationships. Is that what you're seeing happen?
I think that's a part of it. I think sometimes those roots or those bonds are less deep and less strong when you have more transient populations in this day and age.
Yeah.
The world's a lot smaller, but yet at the same time bigger that makes any sense, And it's always one of those things I think there's a phenomenon where in larger metropolitan areas or in larger cities, it seems like loneliness
Mm.
is more prevalent
Yeah.
than in a smaller town or a smaller community. And then that's the irony. And it's maybe we're getting at something there.
Yeah, well,
And
that's the question I'm trying to understand here. Is you're
mm,
right. In cities, people do feel more lonely. I work in with a particular regional area, and the people there, and there's a lot of people moving there, so they love it because of the connections that they're developing. Where they know all the people in their street, where they were in the city, they'd lived there for 10, 15 years in that same street, didn't know anybody. Is that, from that perspective, how does that work from that side of things? Because even if you're in the same spot in the city, people are not having that connection. What do you think it is that makes people not connect in the city? Are we scared of each other, or are we what is it?
I think there's just I think when people are more, I think, more itemized now, or more atomized than they ever were before. So
Mm,
when you have more transient people, more in a more location with a lot of quote unquote transplants. I lived in the New York area for a few years in my 20s.
yeah,
It was harder for me to build relationships because I didn't know anybody.
yeah,
I knew the people that I when I moved for a job, I knew the people in my office and some
mm,
coworkers. But other than that, I didn't really know anybody at all in that area. I was completely new to the area, and I'm being in my mid 20s to late 20s at the time. I was out of school, so I didn't have like a younger kind of network or organic social circle from
yeah,
school. That I find that was more, it was much more challenging as a young adult, even in my 20s, to build relationships with new relationships with friends and that social circle. Where now, at my current stage of life, now I've essentially moved back to where I grew up.
yeah,
Now I have a young family.
mm,
I've made friends with some of my kids' parents
mm,
and the local neighbors because we're all kind of in one area. We share something in common that we at least live in the same town. Many of us have young children or children. So I see them around the schools. I'll see them at a local fundraiser. I'll see them at a local ball game or amusement park or something along those lines where we start to maybe say, hey, let's um, let's carpool together and do this. And you organically just kind of become almost I call it almost like kid friends at first.
yeah,
You bonded through your children,
yeah. That's
and I
interesting.
feel like when you're yeah, mhm.
No, go ahead.
I feel like when you are single, and fully single and not in a traditional family structure, that you are more atomized, and
Mm,
I feel that, and when you don't have extended family around, and you don't have friends that you grew up with or made in your more formative years, and I would say formative years would be high school and younger.
mhm,
It's much more challenging, and I think it's something that is really not discussed enough in modern society, especially in places like the United States, where quote unquote more service economy and more high tech economy exists,
mm.
and with more transient workers, I don't think that that's something that's addressed enough.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because when we talk about it from that perspective, I mean, when we go to school, we just meet people because, as you say, we have things in common. We're doing
Correct.
the same schoolwork together, or we're playing in the playground, we're playing the same games together, and we form those bonds that way. And then if we move away from that, we really haven't been taught, because as you're talking about that, I'm thinking we really haven't been taught this ability to actually go and meet people. It just kind of, as you say, it happens organically.
It does. It absolutely
Yeah.
does.
Because
Hmm.
I mean, that's interesting, because again, I'd never, it's funny, I feel like now, the more I do this, the more I feel like I'm this weird guy, because when I was younger, um, I grew up in a little small town, but then when I was in grade 6, I'm not sure what the equivalent is in the US, but you're still in primary school, we went on a holiday to a different state, And for whatever reason, we decided to do a child swap. I think it was our idea. And their oldest, we went to my uncle and aunt's house, who was in a different state. We went there for Christmas.
Okay.
And then we, for what I said, we did a child swap. I don't know. I think it was our idea, the kid's idea. Can't remember. But I stayed in South Australia with my uncle and aunt. Their oldest daughter went back with my family and stayed with us. So we kind of did this child swap, and I had to meet new people. So I went to a new school and I had to meet new people. And then when I came back, because I was the cool kid or one of the cool kids at my original school, I came back thinking I'm going to be the cool kid, and I wasn't. I had to relearn how to make friends. I was like down the
But
bottom of the food chain.
You
Yeah.
start,
So
you start with a clean slate, good or bad.
yeah. So I was just wondering from that perspective, from guys feeling lonely, I mean, do you think that's part of the contributor, that we actually haven't learned these skills as to how to go out and meet people? I mean, so I had to do it in various stages of my life. When left, had to meet new people. When I came back, had to meet new people. Then we changed schools. I changed schools twice. I had to meet new people. So even though that was organic, I was kind of, because I was being thrown into these situations, I was learning this way of meeting new people. Um, and and I'm just wondering, do we need to have, that discussion or that knowledge, instead of it's just organic, but this is how you actually do meet people for
I think that we do. I think it's
yeah.
almost. I think it's a practical skill that needs to be taught or learned or at least discussed
Mm.
because it really isn't.
Because it's one of those things. It's like when you a friend of mine recently put it as the beginners suck. It's like when you learn anything new, you're going to be terrible at it. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's something you have no experience whatsoever, you're going to be terrible at it. But when you think about it from that perspective, if we're looking at building friendships, if you don't have any experience of that, and this is where I'm like you were saying, you went to New York, you didn't know anybody. If you don't know how to meet anybody, you try and step out and meet people, unless you've got that organically from when you were young,
Mhm.
you're probably going to suck at it going out and meet people. You're going to feel awkward. You're going to feel weird. You're going to, no.
Mhm.
I
And
remember.
especially, yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say from that perspective, I mean, what is that something that we should be adding to this framework of, what is manly, is going, okay, this is part of, a process for meeting people, but also too, sometimes you're going to suck at it and that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. You have to sometimes fall on your face. And
Yeah.
when for me, when I moved to New York, and then
Mm,
New York City is a lot. The New York City area is a lot different from, s- relatively speaking, a rural area in Wisconsin.
yeah.
That was a culture change, and
Yeah.
um, I was not the norm there.
Mm,
But I think in addition with that, some of the challenges that might happen, especially for young men,
mm,
is sure it might you might be in a new area, you might even lack some of the social skills or confidence. Um, but I think, quite frankly, some of it is because when you are, and it doesn't have to be necessarily when you're young, but if you have limited means, which I did in my 20s, I didn't
Well,
have much money.
most young people do. Yeah. That's just,
Didn't have much money. I mean,
yeah.
I had enough to just basically cover the bills with a few roommates and really living very much within my means. That's increasingly even more challenging
Mm,
to go out and meet people, to even go out and date because I can barely just pay the bills. So
yeah.
that's an added layer to it.
How does that,
Do
I
you know?
mean, from your perspective when you were there, I mean, how did that, affect your psyche when you're going, okay, I can just barely pay the bills, and, with this what is manly framework, I mean, there's this expectation, I think guys generally have an expectation of being a provider. How does that
Sure.
affect your psyche when you're looking at that going, oh, I want to go out on a date, and I don't have much money, and
It was difficult
yeah,
because a lot of times even in even the modern time we are generally it's a default to be more of the provider, pay on the first date or whatever that kind of more traditional
mm,
chivalry looks like.
yeah,
Um, and when you're unable to, or it's a stretch,
mm,
it does mess with your psyche a little bit. Also, you have to sometimes watch that you're not taking advantage of, especially when you might not even have that much money. But it might hurt even more if you feel like someone's trying to pull a fast one on you or just get some
Mm.
free dates or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You have limited means. And honestly, it hurts more when you don't have much money and
Mm.
you feel like you got taken. It does. You know?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective as well, because yeah, from that side of things, it's okay. You want to be genuine. You behave in a
Sure.
genuine way, and then someone
Mhm.
takes advantage of that. That could affect your ability to want to go out and try again. Is that something that we
I
need to
would
be aware
agree.
of?
I think it needs to be discussed more, and
Yeah.
I think a lot of young men run into issues where, and I think young women too, don't get
Yeah.
me wrong, run into issues where that affects their ability to pair bond, where
Mm.
they feel like there's not much trust in the dating game, especially in
Yeah.
this day and age. So
Yeah.
I can
So
go
how
on very long
how
about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it reminds me, and the regular listeners will know the story, and maybe you've heard this story as well. It's a friend that I was in the army with many, many, many years ago, and he wasn't that bright. He was a good-looking guy, but he wasn't that bright. But he was always dating these really amazing women. They were great looking, they're intelligent, they were kind, they were doctors, lawyers, all that kind of thing. And we couldn't work it out. My friends and I couldn't work it out. One day I decided I was going to ask him. So I went up and said, Shane, how is it that you're dating all these great looking women? And he turned into this, because I said to him, "You're not that bright." I said, "How is it you're doing this?" I actually literally said that to him. And he turned into this wise Yoda type guy. I put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, Damien, what you don't see is I ask a lot. Most of them say no. You just see the ones that say yes.
Mhm.
And I was like, for me, it was a really inspirational point of view, just from a life lesson, to just keep trying. How do we, encourage men or young men, or any men, to go, well, okay, sometimes you're going to get these knockbacks. You just need to have that faith in yourself that you'll get there eventually.
Yeah, well, that's a big question.
Mm.
For someone like me, who I feel like I I struggled quite a bit personally and professionally for many many years in my young adulthood.
Mm.
Um, I just had to keep going, and but what I think does help is um, seeing someone of a similar background's the right word, someone of a similar situation to you, even if they might
Mm.
not necessarily have some of the
Yeah.
same. They could be a totally different upbringing or socioeconomic class, but if they feel like their story is similar to yours and they finally had success or they finally got what they were looking for in that specific time in their life,
Mm.
that really helps a lot of young men, I think. Just the promise of the future when and actually believing that they can get the win or
Mm.
wins is very good, because otherwise, I think quite frankly, I think what happens to a lot of young men in this day and age is that they give up, they check out, they become bitter.
Mm.
Cynicism creeps in, and that doesn't benefit anybody when that happens. And I can see why that would happen because it happened to me, but I
Yeah.
snapped out of it.
How did you snap out of it? You met
Uh,
this
um,
amazing woman and you got married and had children.
it wasn't even just necessarily women too. I mean, I had many many job changes in my 20s.
Mm.
Um, I had many instances where I feel like I was undervalued at an employer or
Mm.
an organization, or it was years, just many many years, feeling I was underpaid.
Mm.
Then I feel like I finally got to a point where something had to change. I went back to school. I went into tech. So that was
Mm.
a really big change for me, and that was in my early 30s when I did that. Mark's obviously that still is a pretty young age, but
Yeah.
I was one of the older people in my class.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that it, 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 you might have to make a transformative decision if you keep doing, like, the whole thing. If you keep getting the same results, you're gonna have definition of insanity. You keep doing the same things, you can expect different results. Or how the, I
Yeah,
forgot exactly
Einstein said
verbatim.
that. So,
Einstein, yeah, that Einstein quote.
you know,
It's true.
we'll
And
call it that.
I was just pounding sand for years.
How do you think, I mean, from that perspective, because what you sounds like you're talking about there is personal responsibility. You realized it's not the world, it's me. Um, I need to do something different, and you did.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Mm-hmm.
that part of what that framework needs to be? I mean, because there seems to be a lot of everyone gets a trophy now, and that's why I love you guys in the US. I'm a big NASCAR supporter. I love the sport because only one person gets a trophy. There's no one else,
Yeah,
and it's
it's great. I love NASCAR too.
yeah. So it's one of those things where I just from that perspective, I love it. Do we need a bit more of that instead of saying, "Oh, I'm entitled to because I'm alive." But yes, you're entitled to. You should have basic freedoms and things like that. Completely agree with that, and I love that we live in the free societies that we do because we do have that choice. Do we need more around that framework of going, well, there's responsibility that comes with that choice too. To quote Spider-Man, great power comes great responsibility. Is it a case of we need to say, hey, it's stop blaming the world. If you want something different, do something different.
I fully, I 100% agree with that. I
Mm.
do, but I think sometimes I feel like I've always been a kind of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah.
But I do think sometimes I do think it could benefit certain men to hear, maybe you did get a bad hand. Maybe yes, it is difficult for you to achieve X, Y, and Z than it was maybe 30 years ago
Mm.
or two generations ago. So I think maybe for someone like me, who I would say classify myself as an older millennial,
Yeah.
um, I think uh, I think I saw it a lot with when I got out of university, which was right in the 2007 2008, right in that crisis here in the United States with the 2008 panic.
Mm.
I think there was a lot of us older millennials and young Gen X that, especially us older millennials, that I feel like we were kind of in this odd time where 20 years ago when I went to college, it was you could get a fifty to $100,000 loan almost no problem,
Mm.
or just something equivalent to a state in-state school. So I think my issue, what I'm trying to say here is, that I think obviously personal responsibility is big, but I think we also have to be mindful that we might be, from a generation perspective, or maybe where you're from or your background, sometimes you aren't dealt with the best cards, or someone in the
Mm.
past or someone maybe in the future might have been dealt better cards. But yes, it is ultimately up to you. Um, that's why I see some of a lot of those a lot of the generational bashing. I try not to get into that too much, even though
No,
I kind
definitely not.
of. Um, I think a lot of
I don't think
I think
age
a
has
lot of
anything to do with being motivated or demotivated. I know some young people that are highly motivated, very intelligent. They get out there and give it a
right,
go, and I know older people that just sit on their ass and do nothing. It's got nothing to do with the generation. I think it's
I
a
agree.
attitude.
Sure, no, absolutely. But I mean, I just sometimes see where I was compared to my dad, to relation to
Mm.
my father. For example, my dad had both kids, both me and my sister, in his mid to late 20s.
Mm.
I didn't start having a family till I was in my mid to late 30s.
Mm.
Um, my dad bought his first home at 24.
Yeah.
I didn't buy my first home when I was 36, almost 37. I
Mm.
think sometimes there might, and it might be just different. Maybe that might be my story. I don't know, but I feel like a lot of us in my generation, we hit certain milestones a lot later than was in
Mm.
the past.
Yeah, similar sort. I mean, I look at my parents. I mean, my dad was 22 when I was born, and I
That's
didn't
nice.
have I didn't have my son until I was 35.
Right.
It's like, well, I didn't have him, but I helped make him.
Right. I had one too. That's right. Yeah. No,
And
I
it's
get
and
you.
it's a different, it's a different it is a different dynamic, and as you say, there are different problems. Is it what you're talking about there? Is that more acknowledgement of, hey, you've got different issues to deal with, and and is it part of, in a way, asking for some guidance as to how do we deal with that issue? Is that coming down to that asking for help?
I know I would agree. I would agree. Or sometimes I know that I would sometimes butt heads with some of the older men in my life, whether it was my father or an uncle or somebody. And it was obviously I have a great relationship with my father or my uncle or whoever it was. But
Hmm.
sometimes I think they try to compare their time to our time, and you can't. I mean,
No,
obviously we're
because when
still
they
men.
went to school, it was uphill both ways.
That's a large part of it.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I'm just saying, sometimes I think that when times are, you can't compare exactly how generations were, but
Mm.
I think there should be still certain rites of passages or some sort of time. There should be some, in my opinion, still traditional male rites of passage that happen from
Mm.
a good portion of men. And it should be, relatively speaking, within reason within what it has been in the past. Sure,
Yeah.
my dad might have started a family in his mid to late 20s. I was in my mid to late 30s, but I still started a family.
Mm.
It was just at a later date.
Mm.
Um, so I think maybe just adjusting for who knows, and maybe we might get to a point where the next generation might start having kids younger. Who knows?
Yeah, that's a different topic, but yeah, there are certainly that's starting to move, and because I know, because I'm working in that space as well. We need to, from
Mhm.
a demographic perspective, but that's a whole different
I agree.
story. But from that, I mean, I love what you're saying there. This part of recognizing that all right, you've got problems, but the problems are different, and that
Yes.
would be very true. Because I look at my dad, for example, and he worked in the same organization his entire career, from when he was an apprentice at I think
Mhm.
15 or 16, whenever he started that, right until he retired. Same organization. Never thought about moving in that, because that wasn't the done thing. I mean, did different
Right.
jobs within that, and moved into different positions
Sure.
and that kind of thing. But do you think that also, before we get in, because we're going to talk about making decisions and things like that, but for the radio viewers, we're going to have to. I got carried away here. We've run out of time for the radio viewers, and so you'll have to. We'll tune out now for those guys, for those people listening on the radio. Catch the balance on the podcast. But do you think, from that side of things, when we talk about the different types of challenges, because like you say, it's not a case of going, hey, just harden up. I mean, that, to me, I think that's a stupid answer to a question.
I
That
agree.
doesn't provide any insight at all. Um, uh, and if people listening are offended by that, you can write in the comment and I won't read it. So
uh, uh,
don't never. I mean, that's the first rule of anything. Don't read your comments. It's never going to be. Never read your reviews. It's never going to be good. You
right.
get a big head if you get all the ones you like, and then you get upset when you don't read them. But from that perspective, is it a case of we go, okay, and I love that what you're talking about there. It's okay, we've got problems. It's how do we deal with that problem? So you want something constructive. Is that part of that framework? Do we need to have those? And I look at it, because I'm having these discussions at the moment with some organisations I'm working with. But we when I was a kid, I played lawn bowls and golf with my dad, and but when I say I play with my dad, initially went with my dad, but then I got separated off. So it was like I'm playing. So I would go and play with all these other guys as well. Even though my dad and I went together, I was playing
Mhm.
golf. I was paired up with another three guys, and off we went. And then we met back at the end of the clubhouse, and they had their beer and I had a soft drink because I was underage, and and then similar sort of thing when I was playing bowls with my dad, the same sort of thing. I would, we'd go there and together, and sometimes I'd play with my dad, but it was never, I'm under. And so I got to what I'm getting at is, like, there was all these great guys that I was around that became kind of mentors that, even though we didn't get into lots of life detail, I had this broad range of gentlemen that were there to kind of give advice and people I could look up to, and I was able to, and I think that's part of why later in life I was always able to ask questions when I had a problem. Do we think we need more of that? Where we need, coming back to what you're talking about, this community environment? Do we need more of that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. I think the having organic um, male elders or mentors, as you would say, um, both both related and non-related, are an absolute must. Um, so you know, my son's very young now, but I mean, once he gets older, and I'm a big boater, and I like the outdoors and all that fun stuff, and I'm a part of a sportsman's club.
Mm,
As he gets older, I want to bring him around more and more, where we can go to a local marina, where I know some of the guys there on dock, and go to the local archery range or whatnot, and just have him around other men that I'm close with and good friends with, that he can just kind of get other perspectives. Because there's certain times where you might feel comfortable having a conversation with someone outside of your dad or your brother or your uncle. It might be just someone that you might see them as a safer person to speak with, and
mm.
you have a better dialogue with them. And I think those type of organic kind of relationships, especially from in their formative years and when they're young men, is vital.
Mm.
It's
It's interesting.
priceless. Mhm.
Yeah, because I mean, I look at that I take my son for example. I mean, and sorry, before we get to that, you mentioned about a safer person to speak with too. From that perspective, and I know from things that I've done in the past, working with men, creating environments where they feel safe. Men open up. It's not a case that we don't
I agree.
talk. We
I
need to be in a
think
safe
we
space to
open up
talk.
very much so.
Yeah. Do
Mhm.
you think that's part of that process where we need to create for men these safe spaces? Because at the moment there's certainly, I know from out there's a lot of people, and I deal with this in the corporate environment a lot, where they're concerned about saying something because they're worried about being jumped on, or they're going to be viewed in it's sexist, or whole, dominating male, or whatever it is, so that they're very, very timid in how they approach things. Do we need to in part create those environments for men to feel safe, to build that confidence up, to actually then start speaking, they can speak out,
No, I absolutely agree. I think it's absolutely vital. But well, I think it's probably more challenging in a professional environment.
Mm,
Um, and, and I think in a professional white collar environment, I think it's even more challenging.
mm,
I was more thinking if how it would just be in my personal life, if some of the hobbies that I have, just having my my nephew or my sons in more kind of just organic kind of male spaces. Like I said, like a sportsman's club, a boating club, or just bringing the guys around, the boys around, in a day where it's kind of a game day, or we're going to watch a fight, where
mm,
we can just go be guys, and they can just
yeah,
kind of hear offhand things from other men, and kind of just learn how to be a man from
yeah,
other men too, outside of their father or their uncle or their grandfather. And those too as long well too. Sometimes it's good to see male relatives interact with other males, with other
mm,
men in that kind of a guy way, and I think it's also very healthy too. Mhm.
yeah,
Because
because
they're seeing another side of their father or their uncle or their grandfather, um, in those environments.
yeah, I love that what you're talking about is behaving in a guy way. Because I look at it from my perspective, when I look at my granddad, and he was very, you know, traditional might be, I don't know if traditional is the right word for it, but he was very much in front of women. There's a level of respect that you need to make sure you treat them kindly. That old chivalric way, always be respectful. Um, but then there's the token too, because I look at it with my son, for example, and I look at my behavior around some of my male friends when it's just male friends. There's things we would never do you wouldn't, if you're at a party, you wouldn't go up to, your friend and, hold them down and fart on their head, so to speak, to put that in context, and
Right.
there's things that guys will do together that we just do, and I'm putting that in context from the side of with my son, and my son's pretty tall and well. I mean, he's got a black belt in karate now, and he's pretty well
Right.
built. He's 14 now, but he was 6 foot, close to 6 foot, fairly. I think from probably 11. So he
Mhm.
shot up fairly well. And obviously with doing karate, he had to do a lot of push-ups as well. So he's fairly well built. So he looks a lot older than he is. And I have catch ups with my friends where some boys get together, we play poker. Now, some of the sledging in there is pretty heavy. And it's not conversation that you would have generally with people. It's only because we know each other really well.
Sure.
We really hang shit on each other, and it's a
But
bit of fun
yeah,
that we
that's
do.
healthy. Mhm.
And so when I first took my son, I thought I'd, and I think he's 11 or 12 when I first took him to one of them, and I was wondering how he would go, how he would handle himself. And I didn't really comprehend because I know his age. I didn't realize that my friends wouldn't understand his age. That they thought he was like 16 or 17 when he was,
Sure.
and I was wondering to see what would happen. And there's a few sledges were thrown out, and he just
Mhm.
jumped on it. My son jumped on it and threw back, and it was just like it was as a dad, it was so cool to watch. But he held his own. He was able to do that. Do you think we need, because it seems to be part of the talk is that guys shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. But do we still need to have that guy time where we just guys
Oh,
doing,
mhm.
gross stuff, flicking boogers on each other, that kind of thing? Do we
I
need to?
know, I agree. I agree. I think it's I think it's healthy.
Yeah,
I think it's necessary. Mhm.
yeah. Well, that's. I mean, how do we encourage that then? I mean, and this is where I'm looking at it from that perspective. I can do that because I'm a dad, and I was very much, with his mum, and we're not together anymore. But I was from that perspective. I was very adamant that I was going to be a big part in his life, and made
Mhm.
that happen. Made sure that I was always there, and we could do that kind of stuff. Um, how important is it for for a growing boy to have that role model, have their dad there in their life, because not all kids have that.
No, they don't. They don't. And it's I think it's just I think it's beyond words, really.
Mm,
Quite frankly, I really do. Um, they just boys need men around, good men around.
mm.
They do, and
'Cause I look at that from that perspective. I'm looking, when I was talking about playing bowls and that with my dad and the friend mentors, I really feel that guided me a lot, not just with my dad, but those other men around.
mhm.
And it's they're all gentlemen, and none of them, they were all kind, thoughtful, helpful, men. Um, and I think that's part of was a big part of what helped shape me. How do we create that, get because it seems to be, men seem lost with that. Do we just get everyone going to bowls clubs, or how do we do that?
And I think I think we're at the point now that I think one thing that I've tried to do in recent years, knowing
Mm,
that how important it is to have in general to have community with other families and men and women and children and all that. Don't get me wrong, it's all big, but this one being more actually, I'm glad we brought on the topic of boys and men and more of kind of male oriented cultures and communities.
mm,
I think now we're at a point where I think we just have to start small because I see some of these kind of classic male institutions or fraternities or whatnot are kind of aging out.
mm,
Um, they're not having many new members,
mm,
um, And I feel like now is the time. I almost see it with and unfortunately, I've seen it in a bad way too, where a lot
Mm.
of young men have become radicalized in this day
Yeah.
and age
Yeah.
um, through these online forums and a lot of these things, because that there isn't much of an outlet for these young men in particular,
Mm.
where they are hearing a lot of this quote unquote real talk from men who are much older than them or men very similar to them with very similar experiences and said kind of like, oh, this is the way, or this is why this is, and this is how this got better. I can see why people can, I think we have to guard ourselves from developing male energy or these communities to be toxic or
Mm.
radicalized, overly radicalized. But I think, quite frankly, I think that's what has happened when there has been almost like a vacuum of masculinity.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Is it a case because they've gone so far in shutting down men? Some
Right.
people have. It's created that vacuum, and all of a sudden, so good men are going, "Hey, I'm not going to get, if you're going to point the finger at me, I'm just going to step back and be quiet." And it's allowed this the toxic masculinity voice, so to speak, to get more traction because of that. Do you think that's in effect, whilst they've probably had good intentions, this
Right.
blaming men for everything is, and I'm saying that facetiously, but there's an element to that is there is an element
No,
there.
there is
Oh,
an element to that.
especially if you're a white man. I mean, that's isn't that the whole woke movement? I'd love to see the test on what you need to be woke. That's another story. It just seems
That's
like,
a whole other.
hey,
Um,
I've got
many,
an opinion. I'm woke. Um,
Mhm.
that's my little, I'll go on a rant for that forever. But anyway, but from that side of things, do you think it is where, whilst it was a good intention, it's actually now become radicalized from that perspective where the good men are going, well, I don't want to be, you know, I'm not interested in having that. I'm going to get on with my life and look after my family and that. And now you've got people, who are radicalized getting the airtime because all the good men have been pushed away.
Mhm. I think that all has happened now.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like I think because there's been a lot of radicalization against just normal masculine identity,
Mm.
and I think that's obviously, in my opinion, has been is detrimental.
Yeah.
But then also, I think then at the same time, the pendulum goes too far, where you have kind of almost male supremacists or male chauvinist type of packaging energy that I think has gone too, it goes too far to
Yeah,
overcorrection.
definitely. Yeah. Well, there's no place.
Um,
I say there's no place for that chauvinistic.
so
Exactly.
it's the same. It's the exact same coin, just the other side of the coin.
Mm.
It's extremism where it's like you're alienating your entire another just because someone's a woman you shouldn't hate her. It's like there's literally some
Well, if you
anti
do that, the species kind of ends.
right, and it's just like we have to cooperate. Like men and women have existed together and done a lot for thousands of generations here. You know,
Well,
uh,
and I mean, from that
mhm.
perspective, is it a case of because so many women that I talk to, and I'm yet to, I mean, I'm sure they're out there and I will talk to them eventually, but the women that I talk to, as much as and they are very intelligent, very capable, do wonderful things, I'm yet to meet a woman that doesn't appreciate the door being open for her. It's not that they can't, as I say, it's not that I can't open the door. I cannot, as many of them have said, I can open the door, but I appreciate that you do that. Do we need to have that, back again where it's okay, it is okay. Hey guys, it is okay to open the door for a woman. It is okay to, to let her for that's not demeaning her. That's showing respect. Do we need to have that dialogue more out there?
I agree. I think so. I think on both sides too.
Yeah.
But I am seeing, I think, a healthy trend. I think I am seeing a healthy trend of women almost going into a little bit more. and men too, going into healthier kind of traditional gender roles,
Mm,
classic gender roles. I feel like that now I actually starting to see a pendulum almost starting to go back into that,
mm.
whether it's out of necessity or just practicality, or just because it's what is old is new again. Um,
Maybe.
no, I'm serious. Really, like
Yeah.
I've actually seen that from younger people where it's like I
Well,
would
because
not
I
have thought
mean,
that. Mhm.
yeah, on that space, that's I mean something we're working on at the moment because I mean from a child perspective, bringing children into the world, a lot of women that put their career first, and not saying they shouldn't. I mean, but what they're finding is they get to a later period in life, and then they want to have children, and I mean, I think it's like 38% of women that can't have children at later age, and they want to. So it's like, how do we create this dynamic where you can? 'Cause I think the statement of "you can't have your cake and eat it too" is stupid. Why have a cake if you can't eat it? That's just
Right,
ridiculous. So it's how do
right.
we create this dynamic where we can, as you say, have best of both worlds? Is it old as new, or is there another way of doing it? And what
Mhm.
role do men play in that?
Well, I think classic male virtues are timeless.
Mm,
You know, are you honorable?
mm,
Do you have honor is a big one. When's the last time in mainstream culture have you actually heard them talking of the system talking about being an honorable man? Like you don't even hear that. Sometimes you'll hear it
mm,
maybe in some old military. I remember when I was in high school 20 plus years ago in the Marine Corps of the United States here talking to
yeah.
recruiters, you talk about valor and
Mm,
virtue and classic discipline.
mm,
Wouldn't hear that in mainstream culture for men. It's unheard of. Practical, maybe a little bit in sports, a little bit some of it in sports somewhere, maybe some
mm.
military, but in overall mainstream society, you do not hear that. We don't. Mhm.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you raised because we went back at share.care, we went and we're looking at what are the highest set of principles we can hold ourselves to. And what we found was, looking at the Chivalric Code, the Knight's Code. So we
Hmm.
rewrote that. We made it gender neutral, but we rewrote the Chivalric Code. We just call it the code. Um, and I mean, that's on the share.care website. And it's things like, exactly that, having a higher level of principles that you hold yourself to. But as you say, where is that in today's society, being an honourable man? And I know, I mean, when you look at, I mean, in the research, looking at what women like, doing what you say you're going to do is something that stands out at top of the list.
Imagine that.
Yeah, I mean, you might have to ask him several times, but
Remind him. Remind him. You have to
yeah,
remind him.
exactly. But it's part of that, and but that's until you get that acknowledgement from him where he says, "Okay, I'll do it." Well, then that honor kicks in, and you said you're going to do it. You should do it. But you're right from that perspective. Where is that in society, and is that because I look at that, and even though it wasn't, I don't recall it being specifically said with the gentleman that I again played bowls and golf with. But there was that element there in the way they conducted themselves, that there was honor to how they did things. They did speak respectfully of people. They respected things, and I learned from it. If, it was even to the extent, and I do this if I'm walking down the street, in in an area, and I've done that before. I was driving actually, and someone had dumped a whole bunch of garbage on the side of the road, and some of it had spilled out, and there's lumps of wood on this on the road. So I actually stopped and moved that off because someone was going to hit it. Those kind of things. That, and I think I learnt that from being around the gentlemen that I was around. Do we need to have
Right.
more of that? How do we put that out there?
Yeah. I think it's going to have to just. I think it has to start organically and locally as much as possible,
Mm.
because I don't think it's going to happen from the top down. I think it's going to happen from the grassroots level and upward. Um,
Mm. We
you
need
know,
little communities that just we talk. Is it the case of I'm
Mhm.
thinking of Crocodile Dundee. I don't know if you know that movie or not.
Great movie. That's a
Yeah,
yeah, great.
but
Mhm.
I kind of drawing from the analogy there in the movie, they're in the high rise talking about the psychiatrist and what a psychiatrist is, and then she turns to him and says, "Oh, you probably don't have a psychiatrist at and Walkabout Creek to to get your problems out to." And he goes, "No, if we have a problem, we tell Wally. Wally tells everybody else. No more problem." Is it when you're talking about from that grassroots thing? Is it just people like yourself and and myself having a conversation, more people just having these conversations and talking and talking about that honourable man?
Think that's a large part of it.
Yeah.
There's times where I thought I was just kind of an alien on Earth, talking and looking into these things. No, like you said, just
No, no, I relate to what you're saying.
what are you talking about? But I mean, or just thinking about this stuff or reading about kind of classic male figures, and different archetypal males that different types of men can look up to.
Mm,
But I think, and that's kind of how it got started for me.
yeah.
Um, but I think it has to happen really just amongst you individually first, and just your close friends and community. I
Mm,
think so much can happen just at the grassroots or local level. That's why I try to be intent, even though right now I'm more stretched for time because I have a young family and I have a vibrant career. But when I do have some time on the weekends, or maybe one night that I have that I can try to find a few hour or two, is just like, can we organically do something fun with us men, or where we can at least kind of go off to the side if we're with our families and just talk about kind of young, you know, male things and being family men or with younger men around. I think we can do a lot by just going out and engaging in a fun activity regularly. And like we're not talking about work or at a work function, but we're talking about in our
mm,
personal lives. I always think of like the bowling alone phenomenon in the United States. How they were saying how it was so much harder
mm,
in recent years than it was in like in the 50s or 60s to just even have a bowling club.
yeah.
And I think so much could happen organically of just meeting in person fairly regularly
Yeah.
of like-minded people where it's like you have a similar, but you're within the same, like I'm talking about men in my situation where um I'm a I'm a man in my 30s, I'm approaching 40, I'm a family man, and meeting men within 5 to 10 years younger or older that are in a similar situation really helps me because it's hard sometimes. We have to go above and beyond ourselves even just as family men because
Mm,
sometimes even that one thing I think you have to guard against when you are a family man and you are a devoted family man or woman is just almost not even having any other friends besides the kid friends, or like not
mm,
having many hobbies or doing many hobbies. That happens very often, and it's unfortunate. And I think so many things can happen from that organic, regular meeting of of a small local community, even if it's in a fun activity. Mhm.
yeah. Do you think from that perspective it is like you say, you felt like an alien out there? But when you look at the media, for example, um, and I try to avoid it a lot,
Yeah,
so I
I
don't
do too.
always see it. But when you see it, it seems to be that is the narrative that all men are bastards and all that kind of thing, and that that seems to be the narrative. But when you actually get out there and talk with real people, it the opposite is the case, but is it a case of having just more conversations with people to get that real narrative out there and maybe tuning out some of that social
No,
media?
I agree, and I think that quote unquote real narrative is more prevalent than I realized. I think it was
Mm,
starting to dawn on me in the last probably 5 years. I feel like there's been a tremendous upswing. I think a couple of years ago I almost was fringe, just like what better term, just kind of thinking about these things or
mm,
casually just talking to people about other men about stuff like this in more words or less. It was
yeah.
kind of like they didn't really get it or they didn't care. But now I feel like it's people are completing my sentence now, or No, really. I feel like
Yeah.
it's just. I think a lot of people are aware that there are major issues that aren't being addressed, and now
Mm.
they're starting to be addressed. I think in a most healthy way, organically and in person. Hmm.
Is it a case of, from a man perspective, and it applies to both, but I think, I mean, if you look at the world, there is a lot more safe places for women to open up. Do we need
Oh,
to be
absolutely.
having, yeah, do we need to be having more safe places for men? And is that part of that dialogue saying, hey, it's okay to open up?
Oh, absolutely. And that's kind of what I alluded to too. That I think there was a lot of classical kind of fraternal organizations, whether it was even like here in the United States. Well, I know all over that the Rotary
Mm.
Club was very big.
Yeah.
But I know in the US that's kind of something that declined. I don't know anybody under the age of 50, 60
Mm.
that's in the Rotary Club or think what you want necessarily about the Masons, but I think of Masonic clubs. I think of Knights Templar. I think of Elks Lodge. I think of just these kind of even just some of the
Mm.
historic ones. Now, like I don't even know what is someone under 30 or under 40 if they were to join a male type of club that isn't one of these where it's quite frankly you're everybody's son or grandson.
Mm.
Well, like it's like there aren't any, at least that I know of. And
That's a good
I
point because
don't
when you
know.
look at it, because I mean, similar sort of thing. We have the Rotary here. We have Lions as well, which is similar to the
Lions Club,
Rotary.
right?
Yeah, and but you're right. It is. I mean, there's not much. I'm trying to think of anything that would be similar for men, but they're really. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, where
Mm-hmm.
you can get together and have those kind of bonds. But when you look at it from the woman's perspective, even gyms, you've got female gyms, which are female only gyms, which is, I mean, great that they've got that, but it's a place where they can go and feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
If you had a male only gym, it'd be, you're not allowed to do that.
Right, right.
Which, but I mean, is that where we've lost that? Where we've gone, okay, we've gone too far on that side of things by creating, and we should have equality. That's not mince words here,
Oh, of course,
for
of
people,
course.
but from that perspective, do we need to go back to having those places where, like, this is a man space? Like, I mean, and, we just recently had the Grand Prix here in Australia. And my friend, for at least 20 years, we've had, he has a Grand Prix day and boys get together and do that. And every now and then, we'll get a girlfriend coming or a wife coming, and they come once and don't come back. But
Sure.
it's kind of it's it's just a man space where we can just be. Have we lost that man space because we're striving for this equality? And if you have a man space, it's deemed as being sexist.
Right, right.
Do
No,
you think?
and mhm.
So go ahead.
I think it's necessary. I think it's more necessary now than it probably ever has been because again, it's it's almost like just a black hole where I don't feel that there's not enough places where men, in particular young men and middle age, I actually think men of all ages, but
Mm,
especially, you know, I almost feel it's easier sometimes as a man that has a family and you're more connected and almost more social again in this stage of life.
yeah,
But
I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, but I can relate to that. Yeah,
you can see
100%.
what I mean by that. But I almost
Mm,
feel like I feel like I'm socially more involved now than I was probably in parts of my mid to late 20s, or I'm far less atomized than I am now
mm,
than I was then. Because I'm involved in after school activities. I'm involved at the local committee in our IT
mm.
committee, for example, in our town, and at church boards, or whatever it has, what I can fit on my very small
Yeah.
plate now. um, I also do really feel I try to be very mindful of men that are divorced and middle aged, or men that never maybe had families.
Mm,
Again, not everybody has a family, that's fine. But I do have special concern for those young men, and I'd say those middle aged men that probably either never had families or they lost their job and they were um, maybe just maybe were had occupations that they were at a job for one job for 20 years, and then once they lost that job, it was much harder, or their work had been automated or outsourced. I'm very concerned about those men in those situations as well.
Mm,
Where I feel like I see it a lot in these rural communities in Middle America, where um, a lot of there's really not too much to do in these towns. They're kind of
mm,
sleepy, middle nowhere towns. There's not much opportunity, and there's high drug use or high alcohol. But
mm.
that's a little depressing. But that's again, I get concerned about individuals like that in those communities in particular,
No,
because
it's
I
an
see it
interesting.
firsthand quite a bit where I live, because much of Wisconsin's fairly rural. So
But it's an interesting point that you raised there, because, and same token there, I've seen, for example, you mentioned about being divorced. I know that from seeing a number of men and working with them and helping them where they've been divorced. They don't have the children anymore because, and they're not being able to get them. Um, and there's a whole bunch of issues behind that. But all of a sudden, they've gone from this space where they've got a family, maybe things weren't going well, but they still had people there. But now they find themselves all alone, and it's this process of having people to connect with, and for them too. Generally, it's there's a number of divorce groups. We call them there's some friends we call it the lonely dads groups, but it's generally there's a lot of people there complaining about how their life sucks as opposed to finding a way forward. Um,
yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
do we need that more of that narrative about, okay, well, yeah, shitty shit happens. Um, as you said, you mentioned this at the start of the program. We've got problems. Some problems are different from other problems.
I agree.
I
Mm-hmm.
know that's a statement of the obvious, but do we need to have that and say, okay, you've got some shitty stuff happening here, and I relay this because I did this. My dad had been, my parents split up, and my dad had been, a long number of years. My dad was still carrying it, and I think it was 7 years later, 8 years later, and going through this misery slump. And I had enough listening. I know I was actually on the other side of the country at the time, because I joined the army and I was on the other side of the country, and I got sick of him listening to him whinge and complain. So I wrote him a letter, and I basically said, get your act together. Here's a couple of books to read, Think and Grow Rich, that kind of thing.
Okay,
And
love
and
it.
and I wrote that to him. And yeah, he took that on board and actually did change his life. And the irony of that was, when I was going through a difficult period in my life, and my dad was helping me, I needed some help financially and emotionally, and I'd asked him, and asking your dad for help is pretty hard as a guy, but if you get over that hurdle, it's really rewarding. And I remember I was I was wearing a suit on a train going into the city, and I wrote to my dad and said, "Look, I really appreciate all the support you give me in this time, because it's been pretty difficult." And I'm going to say the bastard wrote back, because he wrote back and he goes, "No, I should be thanking you, because you wrote me that letter years ago that turned my life around. And here I am.
Oh,
I'm in a train in a suit, bawling my eyes out because I was like, okay, you prick." Made me cry in a public spot when in a
but
suit. But it's when you look at that from that perspective and going, okay, do we need to have more of that? We talk about the man groups, but do we need, because there are a number of those out there, but a lot of them seem to also be focused on the negative, on how it all sucks. Do we need to have a bit more of an upbeat type of thing for men as well?
no, I completely agree with that too, because it feels like there was times where I was, and there was times where when I was young in particular, where I was going through a tough time,
Mm,
kind of like the David Bowie golden years, where I feel like my life was going nowhere.
yeah.
Very similar to young, where it's like there, you not much money coming in, you didn't have a
Mm,
steady relationship, or if you had a steady relationship, if you had a relationship, it was not healthy. Um, and I think with that, I think sometimes the other men that I was hanging out with and were in a similar boat to I was,
mm,
um, I feel like we kind of almost added fuel to the fire instead of solving issues, or
yeah.
we almost kind of just like it was misery and joy, or the old saying, the misery joys companies. That's kind of how it was.
Mm,
We would go to a bar, have a couple drinks, and all of us would just bitch, like, well, why who would want to be a part of that? Why, that's not fun to be
Yeah.
just to be bitter together with other people. And unfortunately, I think that's what happens to a lot of people, male, female, that I don't know if they don't see a way out, or they just become embittered. And that's really quite, who likes anybody that's bitter? Life's too short for bitter.
Only other bitter people, and then the other people don't listen. But I'm thinking about that because as we're talking as well, I was remembering a time where I was in a very difficult financial situation, and it was yeah, I think it was 19, I think, it was around that age, and I was single. And I remember I was sitting in my car. I had a car. I should have been grateful. I was in my car.
Yeah, car that works. Wow,
Yeah, a
God,
car
I
that
don't.
worked, and it was a cool car, it was a little sports car, it was really cool. But I was sitting in my car listening to this. I can't remember what the song was, but it was like, why won't anybody love me? That was, the thing. And I'm playing this thing, like I'm playing it, and this is back in cassette days, rewinding it, playing it again. So you're probably too young for cassettes. I'm older
I
than
had
I'm
a
older.
cassette adapter, in cars, so I could play CDs out of my
There you
Walkman.
go. Yeah. But I was sitting in my car going, I was crying, going, why, and but I was fulfilling that, and that's what I'm wondering when you talk about these male groups like the Rotaries and stuff like that. But back in the day, you had them where, because I know my dad used to go to, I think it was the Masons. I remember as a kid, yeah, and he had his Masons thing and stuff like that, where they all went together and men. He was a young man then and got together. Is that a part of that process? You're saying that slow organic process, we create this by, just people actually starting to do it? Because you say I don't think it's going to come from the top. I agree with you.
No, I think it's going to have to just happen organically.
Mm.
I feel like we're in an era now. I feel like maybe, I don't know, maybe it's new organizations to get started that started small and just grew and became
Mm.
organic. Maybe this is the era where organizations are founded or started. These like more social clubs.
Mm.
This might be the era for it. Because I feel like there are brighter times ahead. I feel like there is healthy change that can occur and is occurring. I do. I
Mm.
do.
Is that because people have
Um,
had enough of the because when you look at it, I mean, let's talk from a toxic masculinity perspective, because it seems everywhere you look in the media now, it's toxic masculinity. But in talking with people like yourself, and many of the women that I talk to, it's not something that they're experiencing. Is it a case of two? It's like you say, I mean, the best way. I mean, a sales technique is always to talk about someone's troubles because they will then expand on it. Is that a case of where it's something that gets media and it's being blown right out of proportion?
I believe it has been, yes, in many aspects.
Yeah.
And then you go a step further and say, well, why, if it has been blown out of proportion, and a lot of people believe it has. A lot of people. These aren't people that are radical. This isn't. There's men, women, young, old that
Mm.
feel like it has been blown out of proportion. But why? But why is it blown out of proportion?
Mm.
That's a bigger, deeper question there. But we don't even have to go down that route. But we know that we know these problems exist.
Mm.
Um, and I think now it's more just we have to do something to reconcile it. I mean,
Yeah.
it really is quite sad that a lot of times I watch a commercial or I watch a movie and it's just, it's the dad's the idiot. It's the Homer Simpson. The dad's the Homer Simpson, and he can't do anything right if
Mm.
he's even present. You know, or and I mean that's that's so sad. It's very sad. You know.
Mm. Do you think it's, and also too, because there is talk about that, and I remember I was watching recently. There was it's a new Kate Blanchett movie that's coming out where she challenges the whole woke thing, and it went viral a month ago or something like that. But do you think Hollywood and well, Hollywood's kind of the center, but all the different media outlets are too scared of being offended by someone, or offending someone, which I don't know how you do that. Someone needs offended. It's not, you don't make someone feel an emotion. My view. And do you think we've just got too sensitive about that, where we just need to go, hey, let's all chill out a little bit?
I feel some of it is sensitive, sure. I think that's a part of it. I think for the longest time, and I do think the pendulum is starting to turn, where it I think for a long time a lot of people, like, whether it's just regular, I don't know if you want how you want to say this, regular people, quiet, the silent majority, whatever you want to say, whatever how you want to describe
Yeah.
that. I think for a long time just kind of kept their mouths shut and nodded, or didn't want to cause any waves, even though they might have just turned a blind eye to it. But I feel like that's happening less,
Yeah.
and I think that's healthy. I feel like people are finally starting to speak out about things, and a lot of them are very people that are very honorable people of great integrity. These aren't radicals. These aren't freaks. These aren't weirdos. This is just regular people that are
Mm.
that are just standing up for what's right and obvious.
Yeah. Do you think it's, I mean, because that was an interesting point that I saw on a news thing the other night. So I don't often watch it, but it just happened. I think I tuned in at the right time, where they're having a bit of a talk about, and apparently Guy Pearce, the director, does all these movies and stuff like that. Is it Guy Pearce?
Mhm.
I don't know. I think it's Guy
I
Pearce.
believe it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
He made a tweet about uh, something to do with acting, or I think it was straight people playing gay actors or gay people or something like that, and it was just talking about, we're actors. When you play a murderer, you're not a real murderer. Hello.
Right.
And apparently it got such a huge uproar, that he took it down. But it was interesting that the lady commentator that was talking about this, she was a bit, she actually supported the comment, and she was more disappointed him as a guy didn't stand up for what he was, had an opinion for. And is that the
Mhm.
case that we need to do? You can have and that's the whole point of, I love the speech from the American president where Kurt Russell, is it Kurt Russell? No, Michael Douglas. At the end, he's saying you can't have, freedom, where the symbol is a flag without the person having a right to burn that flag. And that's part of that process. Is that a case of, from this what is manly perspective, we need to have more discussion about, hey, we can do that, do it nicely, of course, but you can have a difference of opinion, and that's okay. That's the whole point of how we learn from each other. Do we need to have more
No,
discussion around that?
no, absolutely, absolutely. But I just feel like that I, I feel like that a lot of these discussions don't happen.
Mm,
That they're still at a time where they might even happen organically on a micro scale.
mm,
But I feel like a big platform, you're never gonna get. I don't think you're ever gonna. Well, I don't see enough. Maybe I'm starting to see a little bit more with Gen Z and some of these kind of alternative, very alternative um, media channels, like at least some of these live streaming channels that I see,
mm.
um, that are very dominated by Gen Z and some of the younger millennials, or you see 3 or 4 or 5 different, very different perspectives, very different folks, all in one room, all conversing and all being pretty civil.
Mm,
And you would never see that in mainstream media. You would never see that, I would say, even with some of the older millennials or younger Gen X.
mm.
Um, and I'm seeing that more and more organically in some of kind of that very raw internet, or at least what's left of raw alternative kind of media. I'm
It seems
seeing
to be
more and
that there
more.
is more of that in this long form, like you and I are having, where we're having this conversation, we're exploring it. That seems to
Mhm.
be growing in popularity. Whereas, I mean, I look at, and I'm going to pick on Piers Morgan here, where, I don't know if you've ever seen him, but he just generally talks over people the entire time, and it's it's like, what kind of narcissist are you? It's like you're not even listening to what. That's why I don't like debates, because debates to me are just two narcissists turning up to beat the other person with their opinion, not even listen.
Right.
Take the last presidential debate in America as a good example.
That was bad.
Yeah. And no one was listening. And is that part of that framework we want to have as well? That, hey, part of being a man is listening. I love, it was Nelson Mandela. I think he talked about when he was growing up, his dad was a tribal leader, and everyone else got to speak first. His dad ensured that everyone else spoke first before he said anything.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so went around the room. And not I'm putting this into context as well. And I'm not saying whether he's a good president or not. So that I'm not getting to that politics. I don't know
Right.
American politics. But I understand when Barack Obama first met Putin. Putin talked for 55 minutes straight, and Obama
Wow.
didn't say a word. Just sat there and listened. Is that, do we need to have more of that skill where we actually encourage people, hey, let's listen, as opposed to, because how often have we had, I know I did it a lot when I was growing up, and certainly into middle age, where someone would be talking to me and I'm immediately thinking about what I'm going to say next. Do we need to be encouraged that whole, let's just listen?
No, absolutely, absolutely, and unadulterated, unfiltered listening is a big part. And I think one thing that I have seen, to go back to that kind of alternative media and some of the younger generations, I feel like because of the internet, for good and for bad, and some of the more alternative media platforms that are generally outside of big tech, I feel like that the Overton window has expanded very, very, very wide. There's far less. There is a section or segment of the internet or population that there really is nothing off limits in terms of free speech, which is great because that's kind of how it should. I mean, which is how it should be.
Respectful free speech.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's very much then kind of the controlled, very tight narratives about certain things, and I think in more legacy media. And I don't think in legacy media anytime soon you're going to see conversations or with different viewpoints, even if they're very tolerant and civil, because I don't think that's what they would want. It's almost like the sowing of the division or the toxic kind of environment is what the system legacy media just keeps perpetuating.
Well, that's what I mean. I love the show. There's a show on Netflix called How to Be a Tyrant, and the key thing was to all of them. The key thing was to find an enemy, a common enemy that you could rally people behind. And whether that, and for Nazis it was the Jews. For I can't remember who it was for Saddam Hussein, but each of them had their perceived enemy. I mean, look at Putin now. It's NATO, to rally the cause behind. NATO is going to invade every country. It's like, it doesn't have to make sense, but they create a narrative around that. Do you think that's part of what that news is about? Was creating that essentially hate speech against whatever to rally some people that aren't really thinking about it clearly?
I agree. Yes. I think it. I think it is being crafted as almost just very trying to make people have very base responses toward not rebelling too much against certain things. Not rebelling against the narrative and following the narrative that a lot of these legacy medias are trying to establish.
Because that's one thing. I mean, if you can rally people behind a hate cause, that's one great. I mean, it works. It's been done by tyrants for years. That's how they do it. And do we need to be, from that what is manly, come back to, have, as you said, being honourable again? Do we need to advertise that more?
Yes,
and it's got to
absolutely.
come from the bottom up, by the sounds of it as well.
I agree. I think that's the way going forward, because you're not going to hear it from the top. You're not going to hear. I think you're going to hear much of it unless it's almost becomes where they throw the system is almost throwing kind of a bone,
Hmm.
or maybe there's so many of us that feel a certain way and are much more vocal, and
Hmm.
we really are voting with our dollars, where the narrative almost has to bend
Is it a case where
toward.
we need to have those, again, strong leaders in that case? I mean, you look at Gandhi, for example.
Mhm.
He changed a nation essentially with limited resources and just an honourable voice.
Right,
Do we need
absolutely.
more people like that? Just
No,
sharing that message.
I
Yeah.
agree, and
Uh,
I think it's done through sometimes that kind of nonviolent political activism.
mm,
You know, because I feel like you have the moral high ground. If
mm.
I think people like the Gandhis, the Martin Luther Kings, they did things, they resisted nonviolently, and they had the moral high ground. How are you going to beat that?
I
Again,
love
that's
that.
very lofty and big, but and very visionary. But
But I think I would say there's a growing demand for that. I think
I
people
believe so
want
too.
that.
People are starving for real leadership. They really are.
I think it was Jim Rohn that said, politics, poly comes from the Greek, many ticks are blood-sucking parasites.
Yeah, yeah.
But I love that. As you say, we're starved for that real leadership. I mean, because when you look at it, certainly from the politicians and the way they behave, I know when you watch Question Time in Australia, in Canberra,
Mm.
it's worse than children in a playground. And that's our leaders, you
It's
know?
actually not. Isn't that? It's not funny, but I'm laughing because it is that absurd.
Yeah, that's the irony of it. They're our leaders, and they can't have a civil conversation. It's and they certainly don't listen to each other. Um,
Right. And I know I had a moment, a realization with the United States, where I was watching a YouTube video in a country, in a part of the world that is generally a little bit more less is less stable geopolitically,
mm,
and I watched a civil conversation between like people that were very different politically, and I
mm.
was even wow. And if this were to happen in the United States, this would be yelling and screaming and insults and really toxic and terrible. And I'm thinking, wow, these folks who are traditionally viewed as, in a part of the world that is more politically volatile have
Mm.
more civility and a healthier dialogue than we do.
Is that a
And I
case
just,
too? Because I look at it from, taking it from the perspective of, when I look at my military background, some of the people that I was there with, well, nearly all of them, because I was posted to the SAS, which is this Australian Special Forces. The men there were very capable men. One of the guys was probably the most capable, most lethal. His hobby was sewing. He took in my pants. It's like for me
mm,
when I lost weight. Um, and when I look at, like, for example, my son's karate sensei, who's a seventh Dan black belt. Again, very capable guy. But again, and it's always about, as you say, this civil thing. The first rule is, if there's a conflict, put some distance, whether it's physical or verbal, or even there's have it take a breath. Is it
mhm,
we need, again, more of that role model where we take a breath and just step back a little bit and have a listen.
right. And that takes humility. It
Mm,
does. Um, it takes being level-headed and rational and calm
mm,
for that to happen. Um, because I think sometimes a lot of people that I've seen are boist- overly boisterous or
mm,
speak over people, or don't let other people get a word in edgewise. we're not humble, we're not rational, and we're like I said, the opposite of someone that listened, that was calm.
Hmm. Do you think maybe it's part of that too? I mean, we're in this rush. Well, I think we're coming down a bit. The rush world of we've got to get this done really quickly. So you've got to get your point across really quickly. And I mean, when you look at media as well, the long form is now taking, which is it doesn't have to fit between commercial breaks and a 5-minute slot. Is it? We've got that space to do that. So we're moving towards that. Do you think?
I think we are. I think long form content. I think almost when done passively or not fully engaged. Like sometimes when I commute, when I don't commute too much at work, but when I do commute, sometimes I have a 45-minute commute that I can listen to an hour and a half long podcast
Mm,
and hear in background. And I'm engaged. I like the people speaking. I like what the subject matter is. I think a lot of that is really great in audio. Things like the podcast have grown so much in the last
mm,
5-10 years in particular. And I think there really is something with that long form content, like you said,
yeah.
especially audio. And I think
Mm,
we're going to have much more of a voice experience with with a lot of the IoT device. Well, I don't want to get too techy, but with a lot of the IoT devices and the way technology is heading, where I think it's going to be, we're going to go from being just mobile screen to now more and more voice to even at one point it might even just be brainwaves.
yeah, that'd be cool. You can
Crazy.
take things in. Well, Musk talks about that where it's a bandwidth problem. I'm not
Yeah, it's
voting
true.
for or against Musk, but I'm just quoting something that he said. Um, from that side of things too, do you think also too that people, this people speaking up now relates to, you know, that people actually do feel, well, they are intelligent, and it's been dumbed down so much that people have had enough, and they actually they're starving for that intelligent conversation.
Oh, I think that's a large part of it. I
Mm,
think it's um I think they're starving in the sense that you can't have conversations that are even slightly, I don't want to say taboo, but that are slightly political. I don't have, you can't have those conversations um, because that would be off limits in most work environments or
mm,
in some social circles or even at church. I know how that is in the United States, especially the last few years, how polarizing things have gotten here.
mm,
Where I just stay clear with a lot of people with that because I don't want to get into. First of all, there's a lot of spin of politics,
mm,
burnt out, a little political burnout. But I think a lot of it also is that you don't want to offend possibly people that are actually close friends or family because you don't want to get into that right now. And
mm.
especially when we live in such charged times where that can almost come off where people are starving for more intellectual discussions in almost their own safe space because they can just listen or engage and hear um, in those instances because they lack it. They don't have an outlet for it, you know,
Do you think
because it's not
this?
safe. It's not safe in many social circles.
I'm just wondering, is it a case too where because people get so easily offended? Is it a case where we've created um, an environment where the participation trophy, everyone gets a trophy, everyone deserves to have this, where that now they're going, well, I don't like what you said, so I'm going to be offended by that. Whereas opposed to, again, we've created this soft culture where it's like, hang on a minute, someone's got a different opinion. I'm not, because to me that just seems like narcissism. It's like I'm going to get offended. Um, you know, I'm not going to
It's
try and
childish too.
understand. Well, it's definitely childish,
Mhm.
but in my opinion, um, and but is it a case of it's like, well, because you might have that situation where someone said they might have a valid point, they might not have the skill to articulate it very well. Maybe that's the case. Have
That
you considered that?
that's a very good point.
You
I
know,
haven't thought of that they might not have the ability or they might not put it into words, but they might almost they might unconsciously know what the issue is, but they've not had it articulated till someone might have said it. You're like, oh, that's it. Even that it's happened with me sometimes where I'm like, oh, that's the issue. That's right there, right there. And they hit the nail on the head. And I was even trying to articulate it, and I know I was feeling something, but they're the ones that put it right in that way.
Yeah.
You know?
Because I'm putting that from a male perspective. I've had this discussion a few times because certainly from the woman's perspective, generally they will talk through the problem to get to the solution. So sometimes there'll be stuff that'll come out that may not make any sense or whatever, but it's part of that process. And I know I'm being stereotypical in this example, but from a man's perspective, it's count. I mean, read Mars and Venus, and there's countless books that talk about that, where women generally talk through the problem to get to the solution, which means in talking through, there's some stuff that comes out which is not right, but it's a process. But if a guy was to do that, and this is kind of the juxtaposition that we're in, want guys to talk about it. If we talk through the problem and say something that might be deemed inappropriate, all of a sudden going to get jumped on, we're not going to get to the solution. It's kind of
I agree. Yeah,
but that's kind of the environment, and that's why I'm wondering from that perspective, do we all need to take a bit of it? Well, not all, I'm sure it's not everybody, but there's certainly people out there that may need to take a chill pill and go, hang on a minute, what is going on here? But have that curiosity as opposed to immediately being offended.
No, I would agree with that too. And I think a lot of it also is I think there's a lack of empathy for people that because I'm a young man at one time, I might not have empathized with young women because I thought they had it easier in the dating game, or might be someone of a different socioeconomic class, race, creed, whatever it is. I think that almost disregarding what they're saying is a lack of empathy, or like shutting it down, or like, well, you don't know because you're not blah 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 blah. You know, and that can go all ways too. And that's how are you going to get anywhere with that? You're not.
But what you're saying is disregarding what someone's saying. I mean, that is a lack of empathy. Well, certainly a lack of consideration, lack of respect. But all the lacks you want in front of it, a number of different adjectives there. Yeah, so, it's an interesting thing where is that the process that we need to be encouraging people just to listen more and having those again. I love what you talked about those. I hadn't really thought about that, but having again those man groups. Going back to that, being allowed to have a man group. I know from my perspective, I love the time that I spend with my mates, and we don't do it all the time. It's not like every week. It's every few months, if that. But it's a cool time where we just catch up and chill out, and we do that. Sometimes people might need I think that for me, having that framework with the older men was when I was younger. Was really empowering from having that ability to have that respect and listening. But I think you're right; it needs to come from the ground up. It's not going to come from the top. Yeah. We've talked for a little while now. We've covered a lot of stuff, but it seems to be. If there were some key takeaways, what do you think would be for the audience from your perspective?
I think it just. I think a lot of it just has to start with you as an individual. I think it has to start. Sure, online communities are better than no communities, but I think try to have organic, local community as much as possible. If you don't see an organization or a group doing what you want to do, try to start something. Yeah. First, maybe start it online. Start it in your local area. We have to start doing and solving these issues or working on these problems. Yeah. And it can really get better. And it's almost therapeutic in many ways. When I volunteer with young men to do whether it's like a hunting safety course, or I sometimes do captaining. I volunteer to how to learn how to do marine skills and captaining. It's great. It really helps, and I connect with younger folks, mainly younger men, mostly some young women too that I see, and it's great just to get out there and do these things, because then so much can work and grow from that.
Yeah,
You know?
I love that. And I would add to that for the people doing that, if you're starting a group, um, and it doesn't start up straight away, don't be discouraged. Keep trying, because sometimes it takes a little bit to get some traction, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I know from my own experience, there's things where I've didn't get much happening to start with, and it took a while before it actually got leverage,
It
but
does.
kept going. Yeah, don't be
Just
discouraged.
discipline and consistency can go very far. So,
Yeah, I
mm,
love that, Nick. It's been such a pleasure chatting to you
very
on
much
the
so.
show. Thank you very much for taking the time.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you for being part of the Share.care community and helping people around the world prosper. You're creating a bigger pie for everyone to share. The more people contributing to the world being a better place, the better the world becomes for others and for you.